160 years. In the 160 years since the Civil War, there have been a lot of mythologies that have risen and fallen, and some have persisted about why the South won, or why the North won and why the South lost. And one of them has been that the South had the most inspired, raw talent leadership, but the North had all the material advantages of manpower and equipment and etc. And that there was kind of this idea that the South had more elan and more esprit de corps and dash, but the North won simply through dogged perseverance. I would disagree with that completely, not least of which is because of the fact that I am a Southerner by birth, by heritage, and by history, but I'm an ardent Unionist. And so as a historian looking at this question, it gets into a lot of interesting things. And it's definitely a matter open for debate and discussion, because we talk about questions of generalship. I don't mean for this to be a discussion of who's better, who's best, because as you all know, being history enthusiasts, that very quickly becomes a subjective argument. And there are so many variables by which you assess this commander or that officer, which general did better here. Because quite often, I mean, if you think about it, you could have a very talented, very able commander, but if he went up against Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley, the odds were, by the same token, anybody going up against Grant faced surmountable odds. But the question of leadership quite often should also be examined from the bottom up, from the soldier's perspective. I say that as somebody who myself spent 21 years in the Army before I became a historian. Soldiers thought of their commanders actually should inform the topic as much or more than any academic argument. And the quote up there from Grant, just in case it's being blocked out, says, "You can never tell what makes a general. Our war and all wars are surprises in that respect." And so what we're going to do in this discussion is we're going to examine three types of general officers: the military professionals, the polities, and the rank amateurs. And we kind of get a comparison and contrast and see who did what, where, and how. But we'll start off with a little bit of trivia, which I always enjoy since we're talking to a group of history enthusiasts. So we're going to see how well you know your Civil War generals. Now, the professionals, anybody, if you had to name the two most consummate professionals that most people would think of, what for? Who would your vote be for? Anybody?
They say Lee and Grant.
Stonewall.
Lee and Grant.
Or,
so did I.
And/or Stonewall.
And/or Stonewall, absolutely. But in terms of overall command, with the most amount of influence, and especially, unfortunately, Stonewall doesn't survive the war, so serving from the beginning to the end of the war, I think most people would agree that Grant and Lee stand shoulders above all the others, even though there are quite a few others in contention for high membership in that list. All right, now, let's see how well you know your history. Anybody want the man in the middle is?
Sure.
Sheridan?
Absolutely right. It is Sheridan. What about the man in the middle of this one?
No one knows.
That is Stuart without a beard. Anyone recognize that?
Jackson? And the second one?
No, they're both Stuart. But the photo on the right is Stuart as we all are most familiar with him. The photo on the left is Stuart the year he was commissioned into the Army. All right, what about this one?
Stonewall Jackson?
Yes. Congratulations, you're the first person to ever get that.
Someone said Hood.
No. Chamberlain without his famous mustache.
What'd you say? Birdsire? Side.
You know what? Those are Burnside whiskers before Burnside popularized them. But it's Hooker.
Bedford Forest.
Yes, it is Forrest.
No. Sherman?
Yes, it is.
Bragg?
Yes, it is Bragg.
My
Can
goodness.
anybody tell me what is and what's unusual about this uniform?
They say it looks like he's wearing blue.
In this photo, Bragg is wearing the rank insignia of both a Confederate general and a Union general. He's got Union Army shoulder straps, but he's got the 3 collar stars of a Confederate general. And yes, he is wearing blue because he had not yet got his first Confederate uniform.
Pickett?
Yes.
Grant?
Yes, indeed. Grant in California. This one's a little more obscure.
Nothing.
This one's really obscure.
Nothing. Grant?
That is Grant.
Looks a little sleepy.
He did look sleepy.
Stonewall Jackson?
Yes, it is.
Grant? Is it Grant again?
Grant again. I'm not sure I approve of that page boy haircut that he's wearing, but yeah, it's Grant.
Sheridan?
This is one that, no, this is one that did not survive the war.
Albert Sidney Johnson?
It looks like Johnson. You're right. It does look like Johnson, but it's A.P. Hill. There's Grant with a shovel beard. This is the same person.
Custer?
Yes, it is
Yes,
Custer.
Custer.
Absolutely.
Ooh, I've seen
Jackson
that.
again?
It is Jackson again.
Robert E. Lee?
Yep, 1845.
Nothing.
Stonewall Jackson as a major.
McClellan?
Yes, nobody has got that before. Well done. Yeah, this is Mcclellan in 1846. So what we're looking for here is the person standing at the far right. And It's very hazy, but it is also McClellan when he was an observer with the British in the Crimea. All right. Did any of you guys see any photos you'd never seen before?
Yes, they say.
Good. Good. All right. So let's get into the discussion. Professional soldiers, political generals, and talented amateurs. So the question I guess we would start with is what makes a good military leader? Is it a combination of education, training, experience, and what role, if any, does this sheer raw talent play in it? The reason why I don't say a professional soldier in this question is because the simple definition of what makes a professional soldier is simply anyone who soldiers for pay. And you can be an incompetent dodo bird and still draw pay as a soldier, and you're a professional. But what makes a good military leader? Governments and armies have expended treasure untold trying to refine this process and come up with the formula that will always produce good military leadership, and as yet they haven't done it. So, for instance, we can't assume that simply the education and the training make the good general, because we have instances like this. So we have Polk on the left, who's a West Point graduate, but he resigned his commission immediately, I think about 7 months after he was commissioned into the Army as a lieutenant, so that he could become an Episcopalian bishop. He comes back into the Army when he's given a command at the outbreak of the Civil War, and he never does much other than cause strategic and tactical problems for the Confederacy. As a field commander, Polk achieved high rank, but he was nearly 32, 34 years out of military practice by the time he became a general. So all of his education was pretty much for naught. On the other hand, Patrick Cleburne, the man on the right, he was a professional soldier by experience, but not as a general and not in the United States. He was a Welshman he was Irish, and he had enlisted in the British Army and served 6 years in the British Army, got to the rank of corporal before he immigrated to the United States. So he had no formal military education per se, and his training was all down at the lowest level, but he became an absolutely dynamic field commander and was killed finally at the Battle of Franklin, Tennessee. And as far as the professionals go, there's any number of ones that we could talk about. So we have Sherman, George Henry Thomas, Thomas J. Jackson, George Meade, Joseph E. Johnston, Longstreet. Now, what I would argue that all of these men had in common, well, first of all, they're all West Point graduates, so they have the education. They were all experienced soldiers of long service. I was going to say all of them were Mexican-American War veterans, but suddenly I couldn't remember if Meade was or not. But they all were absolutely reliable, solid, dependable commanders. None of them made any of the great glaring errors that kind of cement a negative reputation. Even Sherman, after his nervous breakdown, mental breakdown, however it's wanted to be classified, even Sherman bounced back from that and came back to be one of the strongest commanders in the North. And Johnston comes in for a lot of criticism, especially in the South, for his leadership in the campaign against Atlanta. But one of the measures by which I think we should evaluate someone's leadership ability in this question is, how did their enemies speak of them? And Grant and Sherman both spoke very highly of Johnston's generalship in the field. Grant, in fact, went so far as to say that no one could have done better than Johnston did with what he had to work with. So, role does the professional training play in the process of making good leaders? So West Point, USMA, this is the acronym you're going to see in a bit. West Point contributed heavily to, obviously, and it breaks down like this. In 1861, there were still 1,327 graduates of West Point from the classes of 1820 through 1861 who were still alive in the US. And out of those, 726 or 54% fought for the Union, 295 or 22% fought for the Confederacy, which means that 358 living graduates of the Point did not serve on either side. People have asked before, well, why did they not? Well, some of them quite simply were too old or weren't in good enough health to do it. A few were already established in politics or in business and did not want to leave even for the lure of military glory. And there were another number of them who were no longer in the country. Some had immigrated somewhere outside the US in Mexico or Canada. And 350 of those were his classes of 1820 to 1832, which says that they were the ones who were too infirm to serve and active. From the class of 1833 forward, 30 Southern graduates fought for the Union and 32 Northern graduates went south to fight for the Confederacy. Now, most of West Point's graduates who served in the Civil War are pretty much unknown today. For instance, this gentleman with this astonishing head of hair. Anybody know who this is? Brigadier General Thomas Sherman. And at one point, historians were saying that this was Sherman's younger brother. So no, he was not. If they were related, it was very, very distantly. Thomas Sherman, West Point graduate, career military officer, served quite capably, and then at the Battle of Fort Hudson down in on the approach to New Orleans in Louisiana, he was seriously wounded and lost his leg. So he served competently, served well, but most people have never ever heard of him. Now these two gentlemen, the one on the right first, Major General David E. Twig. I put his date of birth up there because he's not a West Point graduate. But he was born in 1790, which means that when the war begins in 1861, he's 71 years old. And he's noteworthy because he surrendered his entire command with its arsenal and its armaments, which was down in Texas, over to the Confederacy and immediately switched his loyalties and accepted a commission in the Confederate States Army. He was 71 years old at the time, though, and he never actually served in an active role because his health was too bad. The man on the left, General Samuel Cooper, was at that time the Adjutant General of the United States Army. And his last official act as the Adjutant General was to sign the order that condemned General Twiggs for being a traitor because he went over to the South. And then 6 days later, Cooper himself resigned his commission in the Northern Army and accepted a commission into the Southern Army. Now, he was a full general and he never held a field command, but he spent his entire time of the war working as both the Inspector General and the Adjutant General for the War Department of the Confederacy. And in that role, he was instrumental in trying to bring some organization to what was always a chaotic field. Had it not been for his administrative abilities, there's some real reason to believe that the South would have not gone on as long as it did. Does anybody know what makes Cooper, though, really unusual in the entire pantheon of Confederate generals?
Highest ranking.
Say again?
He was the highest ranking.
Yes. Absolutely. He is the most senior general on the Confederate side during the entire Civil War. He outranked everyone, to include Robert E. Lee, but he never held a field command. So for those of you who are interested in really obscure data, here's how the classes of West Point break down. And basically what I've put up here is just how many total graduates there were from each class, how many of them went to the North, how many of them went to the South, how many of them didn't go into the war at all, and who are the standout graduates from that class that we'll talk about or that you may have heard of. I'll let you guys look at that for a second. Bailey, you just tell me when you think I should move on.
Does anything stand out to you all?
One thing I would urge you to look at is look at who the classmates are that wound up opposing each other on the field. Such as Jackson and Mcclellan.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we go to the next page.
Hmm?
Keep making sure when we're going, we're trying to get you up.
Yeah.
Okay. So that gives you a sense kind of what impact West Point had on the generalship on both sides of the war. And most of the West Point's graduates were just solid, reliable commanders, at least those who, unlike Leonidas Polk, had actually remained in service and had learned their craft coming up through the officer ranks. And by the time the Civil War began, they had some practical experience in field command. So I just selected 4 right here that are representative of kind of what I would call the middle level of West Point generals during the war. James Wilson, reliable, solid, hardly ever makes a mistake in the field. He's most noted for starting out as an engineer and then deciding he wanted to spend more time on horses, so he converted to the cavalry. And at the end of the war, his unit is the one that captured both Henry Wirtz, the commandant of the Andersonville prison in Georgia, but also he's the unit that captured Jefferson Davis. August Kautz is one of those stalwarts who, if you've never seen his name before, I'd really urge you to look him up, because he served in the West on the Indian frontiers before the war. And he's a remarkable man. He's the son of German immigrants, came to the States when he was a child, got a West Point appointment, serves in the Army, and he actually had enlisted as a private during the Mexican-American War. So he serves as an enlistment during the Mexican-American War, then decides he likes the Army, and that's when he applies for his appointment to West Point. And so he's one of the few generals that actually had field service as an enlisted man. And I think that really impacted the way that he led. He never, ever was given towards excessive aggression on the field that would result in the unnecessary loss of lives. Major General Hill, D.H. Hill, Daniel Harvey Hill. He is a fun guy because he has a sense of humor that won't quit, but he also has a very anti-Yankee sense of humor. He wrote an algebra, a mathematics textbook in the 1850s, and all of his word problem examples tended to denigrate Northern examples as much as he could. And the other one, Cadmus Wilcox. Does anybody remember his connection to Minnesota?
He led the Jolly second charge that the first Minnesota went up against.
That is absolutely right. It was Wilcox's brigade that were certain they would break the Union line at that point until the first Minnesota sacrificed itself and stopped him in his tracks. Wilcox apparently always really, really had a high regard for the first Minnesotan after that. So political generals. These are the ones who, for the most part, had absolutely no formal military training, but they occupied positions where back in the day when who you knew could get you a position of high rank in the Army, they were well positioned for it. So some of them were quite poor as commanders. John McClellan, for one, I think Grant requested McClellan to be relieved no fewer than 3 times on 3 separate battlefields. McClellan was an absolute thorn in Grant's side. Unfortunately, he was also very close personally and politically to Abraham Lincoln, and so Lincoln was always reluctant to move him out of the way, at least early in the war. Nathaniel Banks, this guy, an absolute waste of time as a military commander, but he was a very well-established politician, and he could play the political game par excellence. And so the reason why he held command for as long as he did was because there was too many political risks in removing him from the army and sending him back home to where he could agitate against the government. And then Franz Sigel is famous for recruiting vast numbers of German immigrants to serve in the war. Sigel never actually did anything very effective on the field, but the reason why he was kept in his leadership positions for as long as he was because he could consistently raise men at times when the Union cause desperately needed to fill the ranks. There were a few political generals who were worse than that. Butler being a good example. Butler, of course, is most famous for when he was the military governor of New Orleans. And in that role, he was probably one of the best people for it because he was rude, he was abrasive, he was unscrupulous, and he did not give a tinker's damn for who thought what of him. So when you're trying to get control of a disorderly, rebellious southern city that you've just conquered, he's probably the best person for it. On the other hand, his tactical field command, especially at places like Petersburg, were a disaster and caused more problems for the Union Army. John C. Fremont, who was one of the Department of the West commanders in Missouri, his leadership was hallmarked with rampant corruption, profiteering. He was accused, and rightly so, I think, of selling influence and giving hugely inflated contracts to his cronies back in California. But Fremont makes one absolutely invaluable to the Union contribution to the Union cause during the war. And that was that there was a moment early in 1861 when Fremont had to pick a brigadier general to lead a campaign against Cairo, Illinois. And he had 2 options to pick from, John Pope and Ulysses Grant. And he picked Grant, even though Grant had voted against him when he was a presidential candidate a few years earlier, and Grant had spoken out vociferously against Fremont. Grant had no reputation at this point except a negative one. And so Fremont's gamble on picking Grant for a position of independent command set Grant on the path to what he eventually became. Now, there were a few who were very capable political generals, John Logan and John Macaulay Palmer being my 2 examples for them. John Logan is an absolutely dynamic field commander, inspired incredible loyalty amongst his soldiers. And after the war, he became one of the leading figures in the creation and enlargement of the Grand Army of the Republic. Palmer, on the other hand, I mean, you can tell by looking at him, Palmer was a fighter. I mean, in this picture, he looks like he's either just woken up after a really bad night or he's just pissed off at the world, one of the 2. But Palmer, unfortunately, would also fight with anybody. So he actually is the only example in US military history where a general resigned his command in the middle of a fight in a battlefield and left. And it was over a dispute of seniority between himself and John Schofield. And Sherman actually had to stop his advance long enough to figure out which of them was senior, and Palmer got mad and left. So now there were some talented political generals on the Southern side as well. Shelby is one. Shelby basically gave fits to every Union commander who had to go up against him in the West. Breckinridge, the only former vice president of the United States to hold this during the Civil War, and Richard Taylor, who was the son of Zachary Taylor, the former president. None of these men had any formal military training. None of them had any military experience before the war, but in every role that they held during the war, they proved themselves to be both capable and inspired. No less a person than Stonewall Jackson repeatedly said that he learned stuff from talking to Taylor. Taylor had never worn a uniform in his life before 1861, but he was a vociferous reader of military history and he had a library that was the envy of every other general in the war. Of course, some of them are problematic. Shelby, for instance. Shelby was an ardent secessionist, slave owner. His morals and his political affiliations certainly were not commendable, but his military talents were. And the truly abysmal. Does anyone want to throw out their vote for who they would argue was the worst general of the war?
Dan Sickles.
Someone said,
I like Sickles as a candidate. Sickles never gets blamed enough for what he did. Some people would suggest Burnside just in sheer bloody-minded stupidity. But when we're talking about political generals in particular, I vote for Gideon Pillow. And Pillow's self-serving, self-aggrandizing, bombastic self-promotion doesn't begin in the Civil War. It begins in the Mexican-American War when he was 3 times ordered by Scott, General Scott, to stop basically inflating his reports from the field or from outright claiming the credit for victories that he had not even participated in. In fact, he was actually threatened with court-martial at one point because he had claimed a victory that was clearly not his to do. And so this political cartoon from the Mexican-American War shows Pillow, he's the fellow kneeling there and he's blowing up. It says, Paul Patton's self-inflating pillow. It's his own reputation. And Scott is skewering it with a sword and saying, heavens, what a smell. When it comes to the Civil War, Pillow is most famous for his involvement at Fort Donelson and his remark that he had to hand over command to Simon Bolivar Buckner so that he could escape Donelson because there was probably no man in the Southern cause whom Grant would want to capture more than him. And when Grant heard that, Grant famously said, if I caught him, I would give him back to you because he'll do more damage to you than us. Now, the professionals who did not do all that well, even with their advantages of education and training and experience. Now I have Burnside and Hood here for a very simple reason. Men were truly incompetent, but there is a military saying that those of us who ever were sergeants back in the day have heard over and over. And it's that in the Army, we will promote everyone to their maximum level of incompetence. And that's kind of what the problem was with both of these men. They were actually very talented, very skilled, and very capable brigade and division commanders. But as soon as both of them had to assume a position of greater responsibility than that, disaster ensued. And of course, Burnside, most noted for 2 great, horrible mistakes, Fredericksburg being one, and the Battle of the Crater being the other. John Bell Hood was a fantastic division commander, but as soon as he had command of the Army, after Johnston was relieved at Atlanta, Hood threw away Johnston's careful program of shepherding his resources and keeping the Army together, and he was aggressive He was a gambler, and he got men killed unnecessarily. And then we have Bragg and Halleck. Now, both of these men were quite talented in ways, but they both suffered from the same abiding problem, which is they were both absolutely horrible to deal with in the terms of personality. Bragg couldn't get along with anybody. And I think Jefferson Davis has sometimes been accused of kind of taking Bragg's side in things for too long. The reality is that Davis was too far from the field and never actually could quite see the effect in the Army that Bragg was having, especially on his subordinate officers. Bragg was just irascible. Halleck, on the other hand, Halleck was Grant's commander at one point in the Army of the West. And Halleck actually tries to get Grant relieved for disobeying orders on at least one occasion. The problem is that Grant's supposed disobeying of orders actually resulted in a victory. And Halleck never had the ability to basically look at the situation and say, Grant, whom I command, is doing wonderful. Good for me. No, Halleck tended to be pretty, I'm not sure if he was driven by jealousy or if he was just insecure, but he could not abide success from any of his subordinate commanders. So when he moved back to Washington to take over the administrative post, that was the best thing that could have happened because Halleck truly was brilliant and he was a great administrator. He just had no business being in the field. And Halleck makes one other great contribution to American military history. There are two men in the 19th century who are considered to have the most personal impact on the development of American military law. It was Alexander Macomb in the first half of the 19th century. Halleck was the other in the second half. And then you have men like these three, Theophilus Hunter Holmes, Thomas Drayton, and Benjamin Hughes. And in every case here, none of these are incompetent. None of them are outright bumblers, but they all had one thing going against them in common. And if you look at their pictures and their names, you'll probably be able to pick out what it was. Anyone want to hazard a guess?
Their age?
Absolutely right. At this point in time, they are all fairly elderly men by 19th century standards. Certainly a bit elderly to be put into the highly demanding physical role of tactical battlefield command. And in fact, that's the criticism that Longstreet made against, I believe it was Drayton, that slow men have no place on the battlefield. Because in every case, these guys they were past their prime. They were past their time. And so not really through any fault of their own, but they were in positions that were just too much for them to handle at that time. On the Union side, we have these three, Pope, Hooker, and McCook. Now, Pope needs very little explanation. He famously gets his rear end handed to him at Second Bull Run after having declared that he was going to destroy the South. Then he gets sent out here to Minnesota to deal with Dakota in 1862. Pope never ever is put back into a position of senior command in the Civil War. And his own reputation, I think, works against him. The great historian Robert Utley once wrote that John Pope was a man who had never used one word. Hooker is most famously remembered for losing to Grant and Jackson at Chancellorsville. In Hooker's defense, I would argue that anybody would have had a hard time handling Lee and Jackson at Chancellorsville. because they just went completely off the playbook of military tactics as they were understood at the time. And some historians have said that if Hooker would have just had a few good stiff drinks of okay at Chancellorsville, he probably would have saved the day, but he didn't. McCook is famous for being court-martialed for the Union disaster at Chickamauga. On at least 4 separate occasions, the units under McCook's command either were driven from the field or broke and ran from the field. And that's usually indicative of a lack of good leadership. McCook was not actually convicted. He was found innocent of the charge in that court-martial, but it was enough to destroy his military reputation. Now, what about the amateurs? Because in the Civil War, we probably have more talented amateurs on both sides than the United States has ever mustered in the other conflict. A lot of people would argue for these being the 2 preeminent amateurs, Forrest for the South, Chamberlain for the North. They were both remarkable men in their own right. And I think I would agree with the argument that I have heard that probably no one but Chamberlain would have attempted the maneuver that he did at Little Round Top that saved the Union flank. Not that the South could have turned the Union flank, but they absolutely would have been able to threaten it because McCaw's brigade was coming up too close behind for the Southern element that was pushing against that side to have actually taken the field. But I would argue that there are others who could stand right alongside Chamberlain for the North, and one of which is one that most people have probably never heard of, Brevet Brigadier General Joseph Karsch. Karsch was a German who had fled to Europe after he had participated in a failed revolt in Poland. He came to the United States and he was working at Princeton as a teacher. He was a classics instructor, spoke Latin and Greek. He enlisted in the Army when the war started, and he winds up as a cavalry commander. And he is one of the few men for the North who ever fought for face-to-face and beat him. So he was no slouch when it came to being able to learn on the fly and showing a certain natural talent for military leadership. Another one is Frank Barlow. Now, Barlow also managed to get the better of Nathan Bedford Forrest in a cavalry engagement. There's this famous story, which was mostly put out by John B. Gordon, that he and Barlow met up at a dinner after the war. And Gordon asked Barlow, "Sir, are you related to the Barlow who was killed at Gettysburg?" And Barlow supposedly said, "Sir, I am that man. Are you the Gordon who killed me?" Unfortunately, Gordon had a little bit of a knack for exaggerating, and his memoirs tended to get better and better after the war. But there's no denying that Barlow was an incredibly talented amateur. This photograph on the right, he was cavalry commander for Hancock's division at one point, or Hancock's Corps rather. And so he was regarded as a talented commander by no less a personage than Winfield Scott Hancock, who knew what he was talking about. And for the South, I would suggest these two as good examples. Brian Grimes and Gordon. And neither of these men had any military background, neither had any former military training, but they were both consistently effective, solid commanders in the field. Neither of them made any great glaring, bumbling mistakes in the field that cost a battle. Gordon is probably distinguished by the fact that he had a penchant for getting seriously wounded almost more than any other man in the war. The number of times he was almost killed but wasn't is remarkable. Then, of course, there's John Singleton Mosby, who was a slight, small young man, no military experience, but he was an absolutely dynamic slash and run cavalry commander. He also very clearly wanted to model himself on no one less than Robert E. Lee. The photograph on the right of Lee is the one that Lee had made to be sent to Queen Victoria in 1863, and the one on the left is Mosby a short time thereafter. So pretty clear who was emulating who. But one person that I would put forward as probably the most talented amateur on the northern side that few people have heard of is Benjamin Henry Grierson. Before the war, Grierson is a music teacher in Indiana. He has no military experience, no military training. He winds up as a cavalry commander, which is supremely ironic because Grierson is deathly afraid of horses, hates horses. Apparently owing to a childhood accident he had with a horse. But he becomes this cavalry commander who becomes famous for driving deep into Southern territory and causing all kinds of chaos. Do any of you remember the John Wayne, William Holden movie, The Horse Soldiers? That is basically a Hollywood retelling of Grierson's raids through Mississippi and Louisiana, major raids. One April to May of 1863, where he went all the way from LaGrange, Tennessee, all the way down to Baton Rouge, burning warehouses, burning towns, tearing up railroads. And then he did it again the next year in December to January of 1864-65, when he went from LaGrange to Vicksburg. He could not be caught and he could not be beat. He was amazing. And then after the war, he accepted a commission in the regular army as a full soldier, and he becomes the first commander of the famous 10th Cavalry Regiment, one of the first all-black units that was created for the regular army establishment after the war. And his dedication to making a professional regiment went a long way towards cementing the reputation that the Buffalo Soldiers had in the American West after the Civil War. Excuse me. And now, to finish up, a few other notables in this discussion about professionals and amateurs. These are the men who served in the war and went on to have major impact in the Army during the frontier period from 1866 through 1899. And of these, there'll be a couple that I'm sure you recognize. 3 of them are West Point graduates, but Nelson Miles was a clerk in a crockery store before the war began. Alfred Terry was an attorney. Neither of them had ever served. Miles stays in the Army and eventually is the senior commander and General-in-Chief of the Army, or commanding general in the Spanish-American War. Ranald Mackenzie at the bottom, he's one of those remarkable characters. He was a dynamic combat commander. He did things with his regiment in the West, especially in Texas and Mexico, that most people would have said could not be done. Unfortunately, he also had a mental breakdown and was retired from the Army for medical reasons and spent the remaining years of his life in a mental institution. Edward Canby. Edward Canby was a solid leader, good administrator, but he's famous for being the only U.S. Army general to be killed by Indians during the frontier period. He was killed during the Modoc War. And how about the future presidents who served in the Army during the Civil War? Rutherford B. Hayes was a general officer. James Garfield most famously was, and Garfield was an extremely good general officer. Chester A. Arthur never really distinguished himself, but didn't cover himself in shame either. That's William McKinley. McKinley was never commissioned. McKinley was a sergeant in a Michigan regiment. And then, of course, we have Groveland, who's the only one not in uniform, because Cleveland never actually served the army. Cleveland hired a substitute to go to the war for him. And then there were those who fought and then served again wearing blue. So Joseph Wheeler was a Confederate general throughout the Civil War, and then during the Spanish-American War serves in Cuba along with Theodore Roosevelt. And these three I've put up here for Winston. All three of these men became lieutenant generals in the Confederate Army, and none of them had prior military training. So they are quite remarkable for what they could accomplish just based on sheer to learn quickly. And here's our last trivia question for the event. Why do I have two men in World War II era Army uniforms? Anybody have any idea who these guys are? I'll be really amazed if you do, but somebody might.
Hughes? On the left? Nope.
On the left is Brigadier General Nathan Bedford Forrest III, Nathan Bedford Forrest's grandson. And on the right is Colonel Thomas J. Jackson Christian, who is Stonewall Jackson's great-grandson. So both of these men came from, distinguished Confederate lineage, but fought for the United States. The other thing they have in common, unfortunately, is that they were both killed as aviators over Europe during the Second World War, thereby ending the line. So that's that presentation. For the future, I have others, such as this one, but this one here, Torn by Shot and Shell, A Medical History of the Civil War, is absolutely one that's better done in person because I have a whole lot of show and tell stuff that's fun to handle and pass around, and you wouldn't get the full effect unless you could see and touch stuff. But now we'll go to questions. But before we do that, here's the shameless plug as a historian. As Bailey said in the introduction, I've published a few books. I've got a couple of those working on right now. There's my website, and my email address is down at the bottom because I'm always interested in discussions and questions. Anything about history, I am more than happy to respond. So, and with all that, I'll hand it back over to you, Bailey, and it's all yours.
All right, I'm on the microphone now. Do any of you have questions for John?
Thank you for the presentation. Can you comment at all on to what extent newspaper editors were able to make or break careers at that time?
Oh, absolutely. So the question was, to what extent, if at all, were newspaper editors able to make or break a career? They could and they could not, because let's take a couple of the most famous examples first. Grant is lambasted at first by a few of his superiors, Halleck being one, and Halleck actually lets it slip to newspapers that Grant is drinking again. That doesn't do much to damage Grant's reputation. On the other hand, Sherman, during the Vicksburg campaign, Sherman was so incensed against newspaper reports depicting the way he was handling the campaign. Sherman issued an order that when he went south to do an amphibious attack south of Vicksburg, that no reporters were to accompany the army. And when a reporter named Thomas Knox famously defied his order, Sherman actually had him court-martialed. And that's, to this day, the only case where an American journalist has been court-martialed for basically disobeying the orders of a general in the field. Knox famously appealed to Lincoln to be allowed to go back to the army. Lincoln referred him to Grant, and Grant said, since you've offended General Sherman, only General Sherman will let you back in. Sherman told him, if you come as a reporter, No. If you come as a soldier, you're welcome. If you come as a reporter, never. So some reputations were extremely impacted by newspaper reportage. Sherman was famously criticized frequently. I would almost say that Southern generals suffered more from the opinions of newspaper editors than did Northern generals. But it's very clear that newspapers had a huge influence on the public's perception of how the war was being fought and led. No doubt about it.
I very much appreciate your presentation. I have a question about a Union general, and I simply ask your comment, and that's Sturgis, who went up against Forrest and was soundly defeated, and then basically drummed out of the Union Army, and then he wound up having heroes walk back in South Dakota. Can you comment on him?
That's definitely one of those cases where you almost have to feel for the guy. All right. I don't see that Sturgis made any worse errors than any of his contemporaries did. He was completely outmatched and outclassed. But then again, how many men went up against Forrest who were not completely outmatched? There's a reason why Nathan Bedford Forrest is ranked as the preeminent amateur general in the war. And it's because of the completely outsized impact that he had. It's really interesting, if you ever have the time, just take a look at how much resource and how many men Union commanders had to devote simply to either trying to guard against Forrest's incursions or trying to find, trace, and catch Forrest. And then, of course, once they caught him, they usually regretted it instantly because, like Sturgis, they got shellacked. I think in Sturgis's case, he didn't make any huge mistakes, but he was soundly beaten by a better commander.
Custer was really incompetent in the Dakota War. How did he fare in the Civil War?
All right, here's the disclaimer first. I have a personal bias against, we're talking about Custer, right?
Yes.
Yes, okay. I have a personal bias against Custer for a lot of reasons. Having written a history of the US Army during the frontier period, Custer fairly merits a lot of the criticism he gets. Now, he's promoted very rapidly during the Civil War, much too rapidly in my opinion, but that wasn't that uncommon at that time. He had the good fortune to go up in situations on the battlefield where his audacity and his willing to take incredible risks paid off, sometimes despite him, not because of him. And so in that case, they say that fortune favors the brave. Well, it certainly seemed to do so in Custer's case during the Civil War. So his reputation as a battlefield commander in the Civil War is quite good because he never actually, well, for one thing, he never went up against somebody like Nathan Bedford Forrest, to his credit. But as a Civil War commander, Custer comes off much better than he does as a general or a colonel in the field against Native Americans during the frontier period.
I have thank you for a presentation. I have a question on Mcclellan. Where do you rank him? A consummate professional or political, or where does he rank?
Who are we asking about?
McClellan.
Oh, McClellan. Yes, I left McClellan off there deliberately because McClellan is a study in his own right. McClellan is absolutely a professional. The problem with McClellan is he is more than one man in the same body. So as a field commander, McClellan, his biggest problem is he can't seize the victory that's right in front of him repeatedly, or rather, he can't exercise the confidence to exploit opportunities on the battlefield when they arise. But that's not the same thing as saying that he's incompetent or that he makes stupid mistakes and loses battles. He doesn't actually do that, but he doesn't win the battles that he could have and should have won. But to give McClellan his fair due, the Army of the Potomac is McClellan's creation. And let's be very honest, it's the Army of the Potomac that gets their hand and eventually masters Robert E. Lee in the field. So McClellan deserves recognition for the fact that he's the consummate professional when it comes to building, training, and administering an army. But he is second tier at best when it comes to his tactical spontaneity and his ability to read a battlefield, read his opponent, most importantly, and fight aggressively and confidently. He can't do that. And in fact, I would argue that one of the things that distinguishes most of the talented leadership on the Southern side is that most of them were able to read the battle, read their opponent, and fight aggressively. Now, clearly, sometimes but McClellan, he's a great administrative general. He's a great trainer and organizer, not a great tactician or field commander.
George Thomas was almost relieved by Grant in 1864. What do you read George Thomas as?
He was almost relieved by Grant. You're absolutely correct. And part of the reason why was because all you have to do is look at the nicknames by which Thomas was known in the Army. He was called Slow Trot Thomas or Slow Tom. He was methodical. He was steady. He thought before he moved. And one might say that, well, in that case, he's very Mcclellan. But the difference is that Thomas just took his time getting to where he was going, and he was there. And your point is absolutely correct that Grant was on the verge of relieving him in 1864. But why didn't he? What happened? Do you remember?
Rocket Chickamauga.
Nashville. No, the Battle of Nashville. Thomas just wallops Hood at the Battle of Nashville. And after that, there's no arguing with the fact that Thomas can fight, and he will fight. So I think at that point, Grant was starting to accelerate things. Grant was moving aggressively and fast, and Thomas was a little bit slower than he would have preferred. But I ranked Thomas very highly because he was steady. He was steady. He did not make, huge tactical blunders. He did not make dangerous mistakes. He may not have moved as fast as his army commander wanted to, but he was reliable.
One more.
You talked about Forrest and the Union guy who fought his way down to New Orleans and how mobile and effective they were. And from what I've read, one of the things that Grant was noted for was his skill in supply and support. How did these guys like Forrest facilitate supply and support?
That is an outstanding question. That is a great question. Yeah, you're right. Grant was a master at that because Grant had an assignment during the Mexican-American War as the logistics officer for his regiment. And he at first hated to take it because he wanted a field position. But he later said that he learned more about how to provide and supply an army on the move from that experience, and it stood him in good stead. In Forrest's case, Forrest has two things going for him. First of all, he's not constrained by, for most of the war, the North operated under a framework of rules that Sherman famously threw off in his march through Georgia. You know, basically pillage, loot, forage, and burn. First part of the war, the North is restraining, for the most part, themselves from doing that. The South, the same blanket rules against that. Lee famously issues that kind of an order against foraging and pillaging when the army goes into Pennsylvania on the Gettysburg campaign. But Forrest was never constrained by that. Forrest took whatever he needed wherever he went. But the other most important advantage that Forrest had in that respect was that he was a master at doing the most with the least. And his men were lean, hard riders who went incredible miles, incredible distances on very little in the way of rations or fodder. It's almost remarkable how much Forrest could do with how little. And the fact is that Forrest was such an effective raider that he quite often subsisted off of supplies that he captured from Union forces.
He was also operating in friendly territory.
Yes, yeah, he absolutely did.
Whereas the Union guy who raided all the way down to New Orleans was not.
Exactly. And Forrest knew how to engender both sympathy and fear, and I'm sure he played both to his benefit.
Anything else? Do our online guests have any questions? All right, I think we'll leave it there. John, thank you so much for coming to us from your home. Hopefully you can return to Minnesota and we talk about that medical presentation.
Absolutely.
That'd be awesome.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I very much enjoyed being with you.
Thank you.